Hey folks, my name's Jeremy. I'm here at Adreno and we're talking today about regulators. Talking about unbalanced, balanced and overbalanced regulators. So what that primarily comes down to, we're talking about the first stage. And what's the function of the first stage? It is to reduce the high pressure out of the cylinder down to an intermediate pressure or a working pressure that your secondary, primary or yockey is going to be able to manage and deliver you air. So when we talk about the first stage, a lot of you will have sat in your dive course and your instructor would have shown you a funny little diagram of balanced versus unbalanced regulators. They will have said, this is the unbalanced, this is the balance, and they would have flicked the page and kept on moving and not talked about it. Because this is something that a lot of people don't fully grasp unless they are really technically minded and obsessed with the finer details. But when we break it down, there's a couple of simple ways we can have a look at it to make it relevant to you as a diver, so you know what you need and what's happening when you pop a regulator in your mouth. So first of all, we look at what's called the piston. Well, generally unbalanced regulators are piston regulators, but a piston regulator or unbalanced is generally going to look a bit like this, a conical shape, and there's a piston and a spring in there, and that's it. When someone first showed me that, my mind was blown. This is it. There's your piston. There's the small side with the high pressure seat and the big flat side diaphragm there, which pushes against high pressure with the spring, and the spring fights against it as you take a breath, and that's it. Unbelievable. And it's been doing that way for decades, if not, more than a century. That's out of this one here, which is also a piston regulator. Super simple. I mean, look how many parts there are. Fantastic for servicing, fantastic for reliability, and just mind-blowing that there can work at incredible depths to deliver you air. And what it's doing is reducing it down to that working pressure with ease. It's doing the job perfectly. And then we move along to what we would talk about, balanced regulators. And a balanced regulator is doing exactly that as well, reducing high pressure air down to an intermediate or working pressure. So why do we want a balanced regulator? What makes that better? Well, maybe for you it's not. But a balanced regulator does that with about 15 to 20 more parts, but it also does it with intent to balance out everything that happens afterwards. So when you're breathing, and you're breathing using this piston regulator, this thing here oscillates incredibly fast. So every time you take a breath, it's bouncing around and refilling the chamber so that you've got air waiting for you for your next breath. So after it's come through that first stage, there's air stacked up in the hose, waiting for you at your primary regulator just to take a nice breath. Now, with a piston regulator, it's doing that very, very well, and it's very, very good for you if you're in a circumstance where you may be just enjoying casual diving, say, nice shallow reefs, diving no more than 20, 30 meters, diving competently with a buddy that you know, and not expecting any kind of duress. That regulator is going to work wonderfully well. And that's the reason why they're frequently used in higher situations or school situations, just because of that simplicity and reliability. If you're in a scenario that's different from that, well then we need to start looking at a balanced regulator. It's all in that word balance. Regardless of pressure in the cylinder, regardless of the depth you're at, this regulator here, so your balanced first stage, is balancing out the air, ensuring in the balancing chamber that is also present within this regulator that not only is it being refilled, but there is more air available for you for the next breath. So it's adding air to the balancing chamber, it's adding air to the hose, and it's supplying air and maintaining what we call line pressure much more effectively and efficiently than a piston regulator. By line pressure, we can look at it visibly here with what's known as an intermediate pressure gauge. Every time you take a breath, and you see that spring moving, A properly tuned regulator is going to sit at about 145 to 50 psi or 9 to 10 bar, and every time you take a breath, that regulator is going to refill and return back to that appropriate pressure. As you see that spring move, well, the better the regulator, the higher performance the balanced first stage, the faster that chamber is going to refill, and the faster the line pressure is going to be ready for you to take a breath. So the balanced regulator, in another way to look at it, is if we look at these two Cressy regulators, a couple of our best sellers in the store, the compact here, the AC2, this can deliver air at 2,100 litres a minute. So over 2,000 litres a minute, that's a lot of air. When you think about a couple of scenarios though, where maybe you want more, what if you are diving at 30 metres? What if you are using, one of those people you call yourself an air pig? What if you're breathing off that in current and someone else is out of air and they grab a hold of your rock here? Well, suddenly that 2,100 litres a minute might start to seem like you're working hard to get it. And as you get closer and closer to the end of your cylinder, that air is going to get harder and harder, and you get that sucking feeling of trying to pull the air out of the cylinder. By contrast, Cressy's top line regulator, the Master Chromo here, we've got a regulator here that can deliver to you 4,500 litres a minute. So more than double the amount of air that's available to you in a balanced fashion. So at 5 metres, at 30 metres, at 40 metres, that it's there for you in a comfortable fashion. So when you think about that scenario before, at depth, in current, your buddy's low on air, you got two people breathing off of this regulator, you got heaps of performance there to guide you through a scenario that potentially could be quite dangerous. So that's where a balanced regulator really jumps out as a great option if you're not just planning on cruisy reef diving, but if you're thinking about a situation where you're going to be in potentially advanced situations, rescue scenarios, and then also the other thing we need to highlight is cold water. If you're in cold water, you need a regulator that's going to perform better and have appropriate heat sinks available to them. That, if we look at, say, the Aqualung Legend here, it actually has these little heat sinks there that stop the regulator from freezing, and it is designed in a way to perform in that sub 10 degree environment is what we're talking about in cold water. So when we talk about the balanced regulator, great example there in the Cressy. If we come to the overbalanced regulator, Aqualung Legend is a great example, and it's all in the name there. Pretty legendary, has been for years, but this is what we call overbalanced. The introduction of a second diaphragm, and what that means for the diver, it breathes better the deeper you go. That's some serious voodoo in that regulator there that's giving you that kind of performance, and which is why it's so frequently a choice. It's because people want something that does perform at an exceptionally high level. You can get right into the specs of what that means for you by comparing these regulators in their stats. And when we move away from a balanced regulator, we can then often start looking at, move away from unbalanced, I should say. By looking at something like the Cressy here, when we look at the specs, they measure work of breathing. So work of breathing is a measure for any of these gas environments where it talks about how much effort is required for you to take your breath, but also exhale. So you will have experienced breathing from a regulator, not just but also a all right. Both of those scenarios require energy for you. And the Cressy here, how they measure it is in 0.6 of a joule per litre. So joules, energy, less energy output required per breath, means more efficient for you. You can check out those details for all of these regulators on our website, or you can even dive into the manufacturer's websites. But the key thing is for you to think about is, what diving scenario will you be in? Do you get nervous? Do you want additional performance available to you? Then that helps inform you as to the right regulator for you. For some people, if you're just happy to be cruising, well then perhaps the simplicity and beauty of a piston unbalanced regulator is for you. And but for others, I mean, there's a reason why people buy big Dodge Rams, and that's because people want performance, even if they're driving around the city. And so for you, maybe this kind of thing can be for you, even if you're a reef diver. Now, just wanted to have a brief chat to you about the balanced secondary. And when we talk about balanced regulators, we often just focus on the first stage. When we talk about the balanced secondary, what we're talking about in most cases is something quite adjustable. And this is where you experience some of the best benefits of the balanced regulator. In contrast to your unbalanced, which is just going to have a demand lever, this here, you'll often find things like a balancing tube, features like a venturi. In this case here, we've got cracking pressure. And what this does is gives you a little bit of flexibility and a little bit of adjustment in a circumstance where you might need it, like say sometimes diving in a strong current. Or in this case, it gives you the ability to prevent free flows at the surface, like a pre-dive and a dive mode. So in pre-dive mode, I can purge that regulator without experiencing any free flow. The venturi is like a little plastic vein that we can move out the way, and then you might even hear a slight difference there when there's reduced restrictions. Then we have the ability to adjust the cracking pressure. So as we mentioned, the joules per litre, the more or less resistance that's applied will then reduce or increase how much work rate is required. So why would we want to increase it? Well, sometimes we might find that there's maybe a slight trickle of free flow. Maybe you didn't clean it properly last time. Maybe it's close to being serviced. Maybe you're diving in a current. And so you might just want to, say you're hanging off a reef at the Maldives and you've hooked in your reef hook and you're watching manta rays go by and the current's just coming straight at you. You might wind in that cracking pressure, and that has adjustment, then both sides with your reg, making this, fantastic premium regulator that gives you the air at the slightest inhalation, but you can also adjust it should there be a little bit, or should there be that requirement. The more you adjust it, the more you'll find that you might even start to see a free flow if you adjust it all the way out, but that is also going to be the position when underwater. Highly unlikely to experience free flows, but what you'll find is just the slightest, you'll start getting air. So your balanced secondary, or your primary, is really very, very important to look at as part of your balanced regulator setup. But again, we highlight even an unbalanced secondary is also going to deliver you air at depth. You just got to work a little bit harder for it. That's all. That's a brief breakdown, folks, of unbalanced, balanced, and overbalanced. Hopefully in a format that's more about you as a diver and less about you as a technician. If you have any more questions about this, make sure you ask them when you come in and see your friendly Adreno staff. And we'll be more than happy to take you through the pros and cons of each regulator. Thanks very much.